I kept the Kestrel Rampart for 31 years before the alarm ever meant anything true. Most watch postings on the spine of the Meridian Range are ceremonial by the time a scout reaches my age. A place to finish a career quietly, teach the young ones how to read a horizon, and let the old treaty gather dust in the archive terminal below the barracks. I had read the Kesh Accord so many times I could recite the clauses in my sleep. 9,000 years old, signed by elders who had no ships, no shield grid, nothing but a burning world and a choice put to them by a fleet that could have ended us in an afternoon. Keep to your system. Raise no armored hull past the orbit of your own moon. Mount no weapon that reaches beyond your sky. Do this, and the Threshold Compact will let you live. They signed it. Of course they signed it. And for 9,000 years, we kept every word of it, exactly as written. Nobody in Meridian City, or any of the sister cities beyond the range, ever built an offensive fleet. Not one hull left Earth's gravity carrying anything meant to strike outward. That was the letter of the Accord, and we never broke it. What the Threshold Compact never thought to write down was what we could build facing inward. I was the one who logged the return. Third watch, cold hour, the kind of sky that makes a man believe in nothing but rock and wind. The Rampart's long-range arrays don't often flare the way they did that night. Not a glimmer, not a probe ping, but a wall of returning signatures dropping out of the dark all at once. The way a fleet arrives when it has stopped caring whether anyone sees it coming. I counted 41 hulls before the system gave up trying to keep pace. I sent the alert down the mountain in the old cipher, the one built for exactly one message, the one no watcher before me had ever had cause to use. 9,000 years, and I was the first. By the time the sun came up over the valley, the Threshold fleet had taken low orbit above Meridian City, and I stood on the Rampart's outer shelf and watched them descend. I have read every account left by the first generation, the ones who watched the Compact arrive the first time. They wrote of despair, a sky full of ships that made the old wars look like children throwing stones. They wrote of elders forced to their knees on that same stone terrace, of a world with no answer to give but surrender, of a debt signed in fear and paid, generation after generation, in quiet obedience. I grew up on those accounts the way other boys grow up on scripture. My grandfather taught me to read the horizon from this same shelf before he taught me my letters, and he told me once that a watcher's whole purpose was to make sure that story never had to be written twice. I expected to feel some version of that same smallness when the fleet finally came. I did not. I felt the mountain under my boots, packed with 9,000 years of foundation, and I felt something closer to patience than fear. Their lead cruiser broke atmosphere over the valley just past dawn, a long, dark hull scarred with the boarding marks of 100 lesser conquests, the kind of ship built to be seen and feared rather than fast. It came down slow, arrogant, the way something comes down when it expects nothing below it capable of an answer. I watched through the long glass as its ramp opened and its warriors filed out onto the high terrace of the old treaty grounds, the same flat stone shelf where the first accord had been signed, kept clear, and maintained across 9 millennia for exactly this possibility. Heavy plate the color of oxidized bronze, sidearms holstered, but not far from the hand. A commander at the front whose posture said he expected to be reciting terms to frightened farmers. He was not reciting terms for long. I had drilled for that moment more times than I could count, standing this same shelf running scenarios that never once matched what actually happened. In every drill, the fleet came in wary, probing, testing our defenses at range before committing a single hull to atmosphere. This commander did none of that. He came down the way a landlord comes down on a debtor he has never once doubted, sure of the terrace, sure of the terms, sure that 9,000 years had left nothing on this world worth a second look. That certainty, more than the ship itself, was the thing I had spent 31 years learning to recognize and never once trust. Behind him, past the terrace, the valley he was standing in did not match any survey the Compact had filed 9,000 years ago. Meridian City rose in tiers up both slopes, towers threaded with light even in daylight, the shield array's ground stations humming low along the ridgelines like sleeping engines. And above the city, not a fleet, because we had built no fleet, not one offensive hull, exactly as promised, hung the array itself, a lattice of orbital platforms strung across the sky like a second horizon, every one of them defensive by design and by treaty, and every one of them more powerful than anything the Compact's own homeworld carried in open war. I watched the commander's head tilt back. I watched him find the platforms, one after another. And I watched the count register on his face the way a debt registers on a man who thought it long since forgiven. His warriors, filing out behind him in ranks, began to slow. A few stopped moving altogether, weapons lowering not from surrender, but from the simple failure of the mind to finish a threat assessment that kept returning the same impossible answer. We had kept every letter of the accord. We had never once reached beyond our own sky to strike. And in 9,000 years of being told what we could not have, we had built, without exception, everything we were never told we could not build to keep what was already ours. The delegation that met them on the terrace was not a delegation of soldiers. That was the second thing that unmade the commander, I think, watching from the rampart above. That Meridian City sent no army down to that stone shelf, only 4 unarmed elders in plain gray, the kind of dress a treaty keeper wears when the treaty has not been broken. I was ordered down from the rampart to stand as witness, watch scout in a line of watch scouts stretching back to the first ink on that stone, and I will not pretend I felt no fear standing that close to warriors who could have ended the 4 elders in a heartbeat. But the elders did not raise their voices, and the commander, for all his plate and his scars, did not raise a weapon. They told him what he could have read in the Accord's own archive if the Compact had ever bothered to keep one updated. That Earth had honored the letter across 9,000 years without a single lapse. No offensive hull, no strike beyond the system, precisely as sworn. And that nothing in that promise had ever asked us to stop preparing to defend what the promise let us keep. The commander asked, low and hard, whether this was meant as a threat. The eldest of the 4 said no. It was meant as proof that a people can be trusted to keep their word for 9,000 years and still not be a people worth testing. He did not believe it easily. I watched him look up once more at the array, doing the arithmetic a soldier does when he understands, all at once, that the numbers were never going to favor him, and that they had not favored him from the moment his ships dropped out of the dark. I watched something leave his shoulders that was not quite fear, and not quite respect, but close enough to both that I recognized it, because I had felt its cousin the first time I read the Accord as a boy, and understood what my ancestors had been made to promise. They were given leave to depart. No shot fired, no ship boarded, no life taken on either side. The elders were plain about that being the only kind of victory 9,000 years of patience was ever meant to earn. The commander's last words to the terrace were not a boast. He asked, quietly, whether the Compact would be welcome to return under peaceful terms someday. The eldest told him the terrace would still be here, still swept clean, still waiting, but that the array would be waiting with it, and it would not sleep again the way it had slept for 9,000 years, while the galaxy assumed the promise had been the whole of us. I watched the 41 hulls lift off the valley floor an hour later, small and diminished against a sky they had once assumed they owned. I have stood the rampart every third watch since, the way I stood it for 31 years before that morning, and the sky has stayed quiet. But I keep the long glass trained a little longer now, out past the ridgeline, out past the edge of what any scout before me needed to watch. Not from fear, from the plain, unspectacular discipline the Accord always demanded of us. The discipline that outlasted every generation that doubted it would matter. We kept our word for 9,000 years. We will keep the watch for as many more as it takes.